So we get this introduction to Alice, and um, she kind of clings to Penny and Primrose. And like I said, in the first half of this video, she kind of appears out of nowhere, but she won't go away. She's like that annoying little sister that's got to tag along when you just want to hang out with your friend and, do cool big kid stuff and not be, tied and bogged down with your annoying baby sister, right? So she insists, like they're talking about going into the forest, and she insists on coming with them. And they tell her a couple of times in not a very nice way, that they didn't want her. We don't want you. You'll get lost. So in some cases, this idea of her getting lost, they carry their innocence, they carry their childhood naivete with them into that forest, and they in some cases want to leave Alice behind because they don't want anything to happen to her. Yet she insists on coming along, saying it'll be all right. And then all three of them run into the forest. And then we get a description of the forest. And they make their own narrow passages through the undergrowth, which sometimes came as high as their thin shoulders. They were urban and unaccustomed to silence, and they begin to hear all these sounds, smell all these smells, and it's like they went out pointing out to each other creepers draped with glistening berries, crimson, black, and emerald, little crops of toadstools, some scarlet, some ghostly pale, some a dead flesh purple, some like tiny parasols, and some like pieces of meat protruding through the trunks. And in all, they say that this place is both dangerous or deceptive. And then that's when they don't see the thing, that they smell and they hear it first, which is, and I just think that the description of the thing, both by sight and smell first, because a lot of times, like if you don't see something, you can smell it or hear it first, which is kind of alarming. It should be a warning. But it's, bear with me because I think it's worth um, examining. It's a crunching and crackling and crushing, a heavy thumping, combining with threshing and thrashing, and added to that a gulping, heavy, boiling, bursting, steaming sound full of bubbles and farts, piffs and explosions, swallowings and wallowings. The smell was worse, and more aggressive than the sound. It was a liquid smell of putrefaction, the smell of maggoty things at the bottom of untended dustbins, blocked drains, mixed with the smell of bad eggs and rotten carpets and ancient polluted bedding. The ordinary forest smells and sounds were extinguished. So we get this thing that sounds awful, smells worse. Basically, it's kind of like this all embodying image of death. I mean, it smells like death. Um, and it, once we get a sense of what it sounds like and what it smells like, then we get a description of what it looks like. It's a very lengthy description. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think that it's interesting to note that this description is a combination of the material world, the natural world, things that are familiar yet unfamiliar, things that are human but machine. So it's described as having a triangular rubbery flesh mask, a monstrous turnip. It is the color of flayed flesh pitted with wormholes, with an expression of pure misery. The most defined feature is a vast mouth, tight with a kind of oh, what does it say? Tight with a kind of pain. Um, and has something like a sea anemone, and it has these powerful with four arms, powerful, and akimbo. Akimbo is when you stand with your hands on your hips. Mix of washerwoman and primeval dragon. So I think that there's more to the description, but I've picked out some of the interesting ones because, like I said, it's a combination of all of these things. And how do you describe, if you're a child and you don't have these words to describe what you see, well, you describe it in terms that you're familiar with. So what is this thing? I don't know. Is it, some people say that it's an army tank. Is it real? Is it not real? What did they see? And they say that it leaves behind a trail of bloody slime and dead foliage. So after they see this thing, Penny and Primrose run out of the forest without Alice. What happened to Alice? Right? Did she get lost? Did this thing take her? And if she really is a real person, a real character, something bad happened to her. But whether or not she's real, imagined, or a symbol of this innocence, the thing in the forest has gotten rid of her. And what I think is interesting is that after this moment, Penny and Primrose do not speak to each other at all. And I don't know if it's out of fear, out of trauma, out of like, well, maybe I'm crazy and I really didn't see what I think I saw. And if she didn't, then something's wrong with me. But what's interesting is that a couple of days later, it says that the girls are separated and they go to these temporary families, and we get a description of what it's like for them once they go back home, and they leave the mansion. And again, their lives are remarkably parallel yet dissimilar. Their fathers die. Primrose's mom moves on, and I think Primrose kind of resents her mom for that and has another family, and she takes care of her brothers and sisters, which is why she can't go to school. Not that she would have probably done well in school anyway. She doesn't. I mean, that's not the kind of sense that we get from her as a character. And Penny's mom does just the opposite. She doesn't move on from her husband's death. She kind of closes herself off long after. I mean, it says that, they lived through the blackout, but the blackout continues long after the war because Penny's mom is so heartbroken at the loss of Penny's dad. So each of these women take different paths, but again, they're similar. And I think now's a good time to look at the differences between Penny and Primrose, both in terms of their names. So if you look at I mentioned earlier this idea of duality, and if Penny and Primrose could almost be like, I don't want to say the same person, but they're complete opposites, and together they make one, if that makes sense. But Penny, when you think about her name, I want you guys to think about the materialistic, the the not in a sense that I'm greedy and I want things, but material, things that you can see, things that are tangible, things that you can touch. And penny is a coin, right? It's made out of metal. And um, I guess that we get the sense about Penny is that she is very literal minded. She's cerebral. She thinks about things. She's a good student. She studies psychology. She wants to know how the brain works. And Primrose is kind of, I don't want, it's not the material, right? It's the natural. The primrose is a flower, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the ancient saying to be led down the primrose path. But it's essentially what people would say when the fairies, there's that idea of fantasy again, have led somebody astray. And because each of these women or children, these children who turn into women, and we meet them a little bit later on as women, adults, each of them take different paths, and those paths are largely shaped by their experiences in the forest. Um, Penny, we know, who used to be this reader who gives up reading and the imagination after her experience in the forest. She decides to go to college and study psychology. And she's not just any psychologist, she's a child psychologist. And she, like Primrose, is unmarried. And Primrose begins this kind of eclectic life of being the town storyteller. She's Auntie Primrose to these children who she tells all of these fantastical stories to. So in some ways, Penny takes her experience from the forest and wants to dissect it. She wants to understand it. And Primrose accepts it for what it is and kind of it moves on. Um, so I also want to mention that Primrose is this kind of bright, colorful, imaginative sort of person compared to we get Penny is this she's a muted sense of she's muted in sense of she wears gray. She's tall, she's thin, she's in stark contrast to her counterpart Primrose.